He ruled millions, but he could not rule himself. They say a king fears conspiracies, assassins, betrayals, armies. But this king, this man history tried to hide, feared something even more terrifying, something no soldier could face, something no wall could stop, something that followed him day and night, his own shadow in the palace corridors. The guards told stories. They swore the king awoke screaming as if hell itself had touched him, that he ordered torches, candles, and glowing embers lit throughout the early hours, not to illuminate the room, but to extinguish any dark shape on the walls. He commanded the light to be guarded, as if the light were a soldier, as if the darkness were an enemy advancing millimeter by millimeter. And when the sun set, when the last golden line disappeared behind the castle towers, the king trembled, because when the world grew dark, when everything lost shape and color, only one figure remained inevitable, his shadow. And he could not bear it, but it was not common fear. It was not a phobia. It was not superstition. It was something deeper, more hidden, more ancient. It was a psychological secret so dark that the counselors themselves forbade it from being recorded in the royal annals. A truth that, if revealed, would explain not only the king's terror, but every paranoid attack, every unjustified execution, every absurd war he started for no reason. Because this man did not fear external enemies. He feared the part of himself he could never kill, a side that haunted him since childhood, a side he tried to bury under gold, blood, and power, a side that gained a life of its own and began to pursue him like a ghost shackled to his body. This is not a tale about a common tyrant. It is not a story of madness for the reasons you imagine. It is the psychological study of a king who waged a battle against himself and lost. But before you judge this man, before you point the finger at his fragility, I challenge you to listen until the end. Because the thing that tormented this king is the same invisible enemy that tormented philosophers, emperors, generals, saints, and perhaps, without you realizing it, torment you too. The shadow he so greatly feared was not behind him. It was within him. And today, you will discover why. But to understand the king's fear, it is not enough to look at the throne. You must ascend to the roots, the ones he tried to hide, the ones that grew in the dark. Because the shadow he feared did not just appear on the palace walls. It arose whenever he made a decision, whenever he looked in the mirror, whenever he tried to sleep. And the entire court knew it. The doctors called it melancholia. The priests called it a curse. The counselors called it weakness. But none of them were even close to the truth. The truth was much deeper, much more psychological, and much more dangerous. The king did not fear the physical shadow. He feared what it represented. He feared the part of himself he hid from the world. He feared the memory he could never erase. He feared the trauma that grew up with him and that followed him like a second body, a second face, a second life. The shadow was the past he never overcame. There are secret documents, rare, almost erased, that mention a specific night. A night that changed everything. A night where a young prince suffered something that would shape him forever. Something so intense, so silent, so devastating, that his mind buried it deep. But the body did not forget. The shadow did not forget. And in that night lies the key to understanding his paranoia, his cruelty, his absurd decisions, his pointless wars, his fits of rage, his inability to trust, his need to control everything and everyone. Because while the world saw a powerful sovereign, a feared ruler, a man who could command armies to march with a single word, inside he was in ruins, fighting an invisible enemy that moved with him, that breathed with him, that only disappeared when he extinguished the light within his own heart. And that is the true mystery. How can such a powerful king be so fragile? How can a man capable of destroying nations fail to face his own shadow? How does the past shape the present so brutally that even a throne becomes incapable of holding him? And the question that matters, the one that will stay with you throughout this video, what exists in the shadow of a man who is everything, but feels nothing inside. And before proceeding to the deepest part of the story, where we will reveal the origin of the trauma, the first sign of madness, and the psychology behind this transformation, I ask for one simple but important thing. Subscribe to the channel, not out of obligation, but because here, in this space, we explore the hidden side of history, the minds that moved empires, and the psychological secrets no one dares to tell. Every subscription helps YouTube understand that you value this kind of deep, rare, and cinematic content. And so, it shows the video to more people, and you don't miss any chapter of this series we are building together. Now, let's descend one more level, because the story is about to get darker. The tension began almost invisibly. A detail here, a strange gesture there, a gaze that lingered seconds long staring into the void. To the court, these were eccentricities befitting a powerful man. But for those who lived within the palace, the transformation was impossible to ignore. The king, once firm and calculating, began to show small lapses of control. He walked through the hall as if something were following him. He would turn suddenly, as if someone had whispered behind him, and every time, he saw his shadow projected on the ground. His eyes hardened, his chest tightened, but everything became more evident on the night the torch went out. The wind entered through the window cracks and consumed the last thread of flame that illuminated the corridor. For an instant, everything went dark, and in that instant, the guards heard a sound they would never forget: the king's scream. It was not a common scream. It was not fear of thieves, saboteurs, or assassins. It was the scream of someone who sees something no one else sees. A cry of absolute panic, pure panic. The guards ran, relit the torches, but it was too late. The king was on his knees, trembling, sweating, breathing as if he were being suffocated by his own soul. He kept saying, she's here again," and he pointed to the empty floor. From that night on, the entire palace changed. No one could walk with unlit torches. No room could have dark corners. No light could waver. The paranoia spread like an invisible disease. Servants were afraid to cough in his presence. Guards feared looking directly into his eyes. Counselors spoke in whispers, convinced that something deep and dangerous was growing within the king. And they were right, because as time passed, the shadows seemed to gain life in the sovereign's mind. He began to see it as an entity, a presence, a being with its own intention. The king believed his shadow was watching him, that it knew his secrets, that it wanted to reveal what he had tried to bury forever. So he began a hunt not against external enemies, but against anyone who might discover the truth he was hiding. Ministers were expelled. Servants were punished for non-existent errors. Officials were executed for assault against the light. Yes, this was the level of terror. Any failure that darkened the floor became a reason to take a life. And the more blood was spilled, the darker his shadow became. But the climax of the tension came when he ordered something unthinkable: the construction of large mirrors on the palace walls. Not to admire his own image, but to monitor the shadow. The king believed that if he could see it from every angle, he would finally learn how to defeat it. The palace became a labyrinth of reflections, and yet, even surrounded by light, he could not escape. The tension grew to the breaking point. Everyone knew something terrible was about to happen, something that would change the reign, and the king himself, forever. And this turning point, this revelation, is about to begin now. To understand what was happening to the king, it is necessary to abandon superstition, legend, and court gossip. What he was experiencing was not magic, a curse, or random madness. It was psychology, pure psychology, brutal psychology, and it all began many years before the throne, in the childhood he tried to bury. Secret records, hidden in incomplete chronicles, reveal that the king grew up surrounded by emotional violence. His father was a tyrant inside and outside the palace. His mother was fragile, silent, always afraid. The young prince witnessed things no child should ever see: humiliations, explosions of rage, and human punishments. This environment creates something very specific inside the mind: the psychological shadow, a concept defined by Carl Jung. The shadow is everything we repress: fears, guilt, hatreds, traumas, unaccepted impulses, what we try to hide from others, and especially from ourselves. The prince, to survive emotionally, learned to conceal his feelings. He swallowed his tears. He hid his fear. He faked strength. He faked control. He created a mask. He created a persona. But the psyche is unforgiving. Everything you hide comes back. Everything you repress gains strength. And the more you try to suffocate it, the more violently it returns. What the king saw was not a literal shadow. It was the projection of the psychological shadow, a real and documented phenomenon. When we deny parts of ourselves for too long, the mind begins to project them onto the external world. This is how paranoia is born: obsessive hatreds, imaginary persecutions, enemies that only exist inside one's head. The king was not afraid of the physical shadow. He was afraid of the trauma it represented, of the version of himself that was crushed by his father, of the boy who was never allowed to exist, of the scream that could never escape, of the accumulated rage, of the silent pain, of the original fear. The shadow was personified trauma, and the events of the reign only fed the inner monster. Each execution increased his guilt. Each cruel decision increased his self-hatred. Each war destroyed another piece of his humanity. The more powerful he became, the bigger the part of himself he couldn't bear to look at grew. And the body, the mind, the unconscious all know the truth. Even when you pretend it doesn't exist, his shadow grew because he grew in contradiction. An absolute king on the outside, a terrified boy on the inside. That is why, when the torch went out that night, he didn't see the dark. He saw himself, the real one, the hidden one, the one he had spent his entire life avoiding. And no one escapes their own shadow. No one. Psychology explains it. History confirms it. But the darkest part, the part that no one in the kingdom ever imagined, was about to emerge. What happened next was not just an emotional breakdown. It was the final collision between the king and the boy he tried to kill within himself. The truth about the king began to leak like water through cracks, slow, silent, but impossible to contain. In the palace corridors, servants whispered, "He doesn't sleep anymore. He talks to walls. He avoids the sunset," because it was precisely when the light fell that the panic began. The king refused to be alone. He ordered torches to be kept lit 24 hours a day. He commanded guards to walk behind him, even when there was no threat. And yet, when the flame trembled, he trembled with it. One night, a guard saw him paralyzed before the wall. His shadow, long, distorted, gigantic, moved as the wind swayed the torch. And the king whispered, his voice broken, "She is growing. She is trying to swallow me." The guard thought it was a metaphor. It was not. From that moment on, the king began to change rules of the entire kingdom because of his fear. He ordered a ban on very large windows. The moonlight makes shadows lengthen. He ordered walls to be painted black, so the shadow gets confused and doesn't follow me. He even ordered children to be kept away, believing they saw things that adults didn't notice. The palace became a dark, silent, suffocating labyrinth. And the more he tried to protect himself, the more paranoia consumed him. Slowly, the counselors noticed something even stranger. The king began to avoid mirrors. He ordered all of them to be broken, all of them, because, according to him, the shadow in the mirror was not the same one that followed him on the floor. "One of them lies," he would say, "and I need to discover which one." From then on, his behavior began to take on increasingly inexplicable patterns. The king spoke to empty corners of the room. He swore he heard footsteps when no one was near. He wrote letters to someone he called the other me. And, most importantly, he woke up every night screaming. The royal physicians tried everything. Herbs, oils, prayers. Nothing helped. Because the problem was not in the body. It was in the mind, and no one dared to say it out loud. Until the day the king ordered the construction of an underground room, without windows, without cracks, without light. He believed that there, finally, he would be free of the shadow. But when he descended the cold staircase and closed the door behind him, he saw the silhouette on the floor. Even without light, even in complete darkness, the shadow was there. And in that instant, the king realized, no matter where he went, the enemy traveled within him. The tension now dominates the palace. The king's fear is beginning to swallow the entire kingdom. The court believed the king had already reached his limit, but they were wrong. The true collapse was yet to come. It all began with a seemingly small incident. One quiet morning, while walking through the main hall, the king's shadow touched the shadow of one of the guards on the floor. The two merged for an instant, just an instant, but for him, that was an invasion. He went mad. He screamed. He pushed the soldier to the ground. He ordered his immediate execution. The guard pleaded, swore he had done nothing. But in the king's mind, the offense was real. He tried to hide inside me. This was the first major turning point. It was no longer just fear. It was the absolute belief that the shadow had a will of its own, that it wanted to enter him, control his mind, devour his soul. And so began one of the darkest phases of the reign. The king started to believe that the shadow could jump from body to body. Anyone who got too close to him, anyone whose dark outline touched his, was immediately pushed away, punished, or expelled from the palace. The royal council panicked. They knew they had lost control of the monarch, but no one could have predicted the next turn. In the hope of trapping the shadow, the king ordered the creation of a device, a ring of light formed by dozens of torches around. Himself, he stood there for hours, motionless, trying to observe the shadow return to its place. But one night, one of the torches fell. The flame went out, and a single spot of shadow appeared behind him. That small failure broke the last fragment of sanity. The king attacked his own guards. He grabbed the fallen torch and tried to burn the wall as if he were fighting an invisible enemy. It took 5 men to restrain him, but nothing could prepare them for what happened next. Because in the dead of that night, the king made the most shocking decision of his entire life. He ordered the destruction of all documents, portraits, and statues that represented his image. He said he no longer wanted reflections, shadows, echoes, or physical memories of himself. He believed the shadow only existed because he existed. And if he erased everything that reminded him of who he was, maybe, just maybe, the shadow would disappear. But the most brutal turning point was still to come. One night, the guards heard strange sounds coming from the royal chamber. When they broke down the door, they found the king surrounded by dozens of candles, his face covered in ashes, and his eyes fixed on the ground. He was talking to himself, but it was not a monologue. It was a dialogue. Why did you come back? What do you want from me? What did I do to deserve this? The guards froze. They realized the king was not talking to the air. He was talking to his own shadow. And then, the last thread of lucidity snapped. The king lifted his head, looked at the men before him, and said, "She doesn't want to leave, because she is me, and I am what she always tried to hide." In that instant, everyone understood. The shadow he feared was not an external enemy. It was the part of himself he tried to kill, and which now returned to exact the price. The reign would never be the same. And what happened next would change not only the palace, but the king's very destiny. The night that marked the king's destiny began like all the others, with fear. But there was something different in the air, something heavy, as if the castle itself was breathing slower. The guards knew something was about to happen. They saw the king increasingly distant, increasingly pale, increasingly broken inside. In the early hours of that morning, after hours of absolute silence, a sound echoed through the corridors, a sob. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a fit of rage. It was crying, deep crying. The crying of someone who finally can no longer bear their own weight. When the guards entered the chamber, They saw a scene they would never forget. The king was sitting on the floor, hugging his own knees. Like a terrified child in the dark, his shadow flickered on the wall behind, elongated, distorted, almost human. He did not try to hide his despair. He didn't scream. He didn't order executions. He didn't try to assert himself. For the first time, he was disarmed, emotionally naked. Between sobs, he murmured, "Why won't you leave me alone? What did I do for you to follow me all the way here?" One of the priests, seized by the courage of desperation, decided to approach. And that was when the king spoke the phrase that would seal his destiny. "I know who you are. I know who I am, and I don't want to run anymore." The shadow on the wall seemed to move, or perhaps it was just the candle flickering. But for the king, that was the final sign. He stood up, staggering, and went to one of the room's pillars. He ran his trembling hand over the cold surface, and there, with a low, almost inaudible voice, he confessed, "It was here. It was exactly here, in this corridor, that it all began." And then, as if his mind was breaking its last barriers, he remembered. He remembered his father dragging him by the arm. He remembered the punishment. He remembered the humiliation. He remembered the night he learned that the world was cruel and that to survive, he would need to hide everything he felt. He remembered the boy who cried in the dark and how he promised never to be weak again, never to feel fear again, never to be vulnerable again. But by trying to kill the boy inside him, he created the monster that would follow him for the rest of his life. The shadow was the lost child, the child he suffocated, the child he abandoned, the child he swore no longer existed. The king fell to his knees. Tears streamed down his face, and in a whisper laden with pain, he said, "Forgive me. I should have protected you and not buried you." The candle flickered again. The shadow moved, and in that instant, something no one could explain happened. The king smiled. Not a smile of triumph, not a smile of joy, but a smile of liberation, the first of his adult life. Because in that exact second, he stopped fighting the invisible enemy. He recognized his own shadow. He accepted what he had tried to hide his entire life. And for the first time, he stopped running. But this peace would not last, because by accepting his shadow, he opened the door to consequences no one could predict. Consequences that would change not only the king, but the kingdom itself. And now that you have finally witnessed the most intimate and brutal moment of this sovereign, the time has come for the deepest conclusion, the reflection that will echo in the mind of everyone who watches. When the king finally faced his shadow, he did not find a monster. He found himself. And this is the most brutal revelation of all. There is no greater darkness than the one we try to deny. There is no more persistent enemy than the one we create within our own minds. And there is no crueler prison than running from a part of oneself. The king spent his entire life believing the shadow was the problem. But the truth is, the shadow was the sign, the warning, the forgotten, wounded, and silenced part that begged to be seen. Carl Jung said that the shadow is not something to be defeated, but something to be integrated. Something that exists so we can grow. Something that reveals what we hide, what we repress, and what we most fear to admit. The king was never mad. He was human, deeply human, all too human. He tried to be too strong, too ruthless, too invulnerable, and by doing so, he created an abyss within his own chest. Because this is how it works. The more you try to bury a trauma, the louder it screams. The more you try to ignore the pain, the more it chases you. The more you try to run from the dark side of your soul, the faster it runs after you. It wasn't the shadow that destroyed the king. It was the silence. It was the fear of looking within. It was the refusal to accept that even the most powerful of men has a part that cries in the dark. And perhaps that is what his story teaches us. That all of us have a shadow, a side we try to hide, a moment we don't want to remember, a pain we pretend doesn't exist. But running away doesn't solve it, because everything you reject controls you, and everything you accept frees you. Just as that king finally understood, Perhaps you'd have a shadow waiting to be recognized, not to destroy you, but to complete you. And now, before we close this chapter, I ask you for something important. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like. It is not just a symbolic gesture. When you subscribe and interact, you are telling YouTube, I want deep, human, psychological, and cinematic content like this. And that makes all the difference, because the algorithm only shows these rare and dense stories to those who show they value this type of content. Your subscription helps this project continue, and it helps more people discover these narratives that illuminate places where no one dares to look. And of course, I also want to know, what did you think of this King's story? Which part touched you the most? Do you believe we all carry a shadow? Leave it in the comments. I read them all. Now, before you leave, look at the video appearing on your screen. It is not just a continuation. It is even deeper, more revealing, and more breathtaking than this one. If today's story resonated with you, then you need to watch the next chapter. See you there.